Well, pride and politics is the theme around our discussion today, and we want to explore how we fight for the rights of LGBTIQ individuals around the world in changing democracies. And again, this session will look at different aspects of what makes an inclusive democracy. And I would really like to encourage your participation and not only questions, but if you have a feeling, a strong feeling about something, because I personally have a feeling about, democracy. And, from where I come from in South Africa, it's got good connotations, because in 1994, we're like, oh, democracy, it felt good. But democracy, if you look at Uganda calls itself a democracy too, but look at what has happened there. So we're going to explore those kind of aspects of this beast that is democracy. And as Maria mentioned in the opening remarks, 2024 will be the biggest election year in world history. And depending on where you come from, you'll be concerned about whether there's going to be, another Biden-Trump rematch, whether you're going to have Putin giving himself another 6 years, because those kind of things have implications on lives and livelihoods, and they all happen under the name democracy. So that will be part of our debate, discussion, and a sharing of experiences, and I would like all your participation. And we're going to start in speaking about the intersection of democracy and LGBTIQ rights, and how and does democracy influence or reinforce the advancement of LGBTQ rights? And Tato, I want to start with you and tell us how, from your work as an activist and from your work as somebody who comes from Botswana, tell us about how democracy influences or it reinforces the advancement of LGBTIQ rights.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon to everybody, and thank you so much to Outright for the opportunity. Maybe let me explain a little bit who we are as Botswana. Botswana is a landlocked country in Southern Africa with about 2.3 million people from various backgrounds. We've got different traditional groups and different people. We've got about 9 tribes and more than 19 dialects across the country. And for most of you who know Botswana is well known for its diamond mining and agricultural background. We have about 5 major political parties in Botswana. And our democracy is built on the principle of government for the people, by the people. And by virtue of that, simply put, it means that democracy has a lot of impact on the livelihoods of everybody, regardless of sexual orientation or regardless of how anybody identifies. And our economy is also predicated on various economic impacts, including ensuring that people have got access to health, people have got access to education. And you may be well aware that for years, Botswana provided free education for everybody. However, because of challenges around the issues of democracy and how open our democracy is, we've seen that some of the members of the LGBTI communities have not been able to go to school because of how they identify, either as transgender persons or as intersex persons. And this is a clear indication that indeed democracy does have a lot of impact. Just recently, after the COVID impact, or during the COVID impact, some of the transgender persons could not access COVID vaccines because they did not, and they could not wear dresses to go and get vaccinated at Kotla meetings.
And in case you wonder why Tato knows so much, Tato is the Chief Executive Officer at Legabibo, and Tato describes himself as someone who possesses a zeal for corporate governance as a means of balancing the interest of the organization and its stakeholders. And Tato has been responsible for pushing diversity and inclusion for the LGBTIQ community, participation in the constitutional review process, passionate about issues of social contracting and community-led monitoring. He has dialogues with leaders in government and parastatal private in the private sector. And I'll also introduce Birgitta before you give your take on the links of democracy and LGBTIQ rights. She serves as the National Democratic Institute's Director of Political Parties since 2020, And between 2002 and 2018, she was a member of the Swedish Parliament, and from 2010 to 2014, Minister of European Affairs. During her political career since the 1990s in Sweden and later in the EU, she was always pushing for progressive LGBTIQ plus reforms, and also actively supported the LGBTIQ movements in persons countries such as Uganda, Lithuania, and Serbia. Yeah, you just tell us about your observation on how has democracy really influenced the advancement of LGBTQ rights.
Well, of course, it's not a guarantee that a country that is democratic is progressive on LGBTQI plus rights, but it is a guarantee that a country that is authoritarian is not progressive delivering. So it's obviously very great for the rainbow community to live in countries where you have freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, free and fair elections and so on, because that creates like a platform for advancing your rights. I think that's important. But unfortunately, at the moment, we are in this perfect political storms for the strong men around the world, for the authoritarian leadership. We have the 17th consecutive year of democratic backsliding. 46 countries are in autocratization at the moment. We can see that in a variety of different fields, we have a very tough situation. And we know that that groups as women and minorities as the LGBTQI plus community, they are the first victims. And we can see that if I look from now I work here in the United States with NDI, supporting democratic political parties worldwide, and we have a very strong ambitions when it comes to supporting the LGBTQI plus community. I'm so happy to have many of my colleagues here from our civic participation team and the parties team joining me today. So we work a lot on seeing. So what I think is important is to also emphasize that to support the LGBTQI plus community in the civil society and as politicians, that's also about advancing democracy. So to see that connection very clearly, I think is important where we are at the moment.
And I would like to bring Tamara Adrian into the conversation. And Tamara is a Venezuelan professor of law and a parliamentarian. Tamara has a distinguished teaching career, having served as a professor at multiple universities in Venezuela. She's an author with her works published in Venezuela, Colombia, France, and the United States. Tamara is a prominent advocate for LGBTIQ rights and has been actively involved in organizations and committees dedicated to promoting equality and human rights. But I have got a different question for you, Tamara. I want us to dive straight into elections implications. Your country is going to elections. And I would like maybe you can give us a global perspective and specifically what it means for your country in discussing the specific upcoming election in your country and the potential implications for the LGBTIQ movement. And Tato, I would also like you to join in because your country is also going to elections.
Fantastic.
Okay. Thank you so much for this question, Matuba. Because following...
Is it just me or is your mic not working properly? Is it?
I don't know.
Here we go.
Hello, is it working? Okay. Now, okay, let me put it a little bit closer to my...
Let me help. You're fine. There you go.
Do you hear me now?
Yes. Yeah. Perfect.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm used to speak to 150 students. Therefore, here is nothing compared to what I have to do normally without the mic. Listen, it is very interesting question. And following the path Brigitta start, it is also important to know that elections and democracy do not go together. That might surprise many of you. As a member of the steering committee of the World Movement for Democracy, I have been dealing with around 70 countries around the world where they have elections, but those elections are nor fair, nor free, nor just. And therefore, people that are elected are not really those who might actually win should there have been a process of free elections. Therefore, we know that in the case of non-democratic countries, in Cuba you have elections, in Nicaragua you have elections, in Venezuela you have elections, but most of the political parties have been co-opted by the dictatorship, by the autocracy, most of the system is completely occupied, and therefore you cannot talk about a just process. Therefore, you will say, what? It is useless then to work in such a difficult context. And then I come back to Brigitta when she said that without democracy, it is for certain that you will have no rights. With democracy, you might work for them, or you may lose them also. You can gain rights, you can preserve rights, or you can even lose rights, that as you are seeing in many countries with regard to what is happening, and we have mentioned in previous sessions. And then it is not another way out of a non-democratic system that try to get into this small interstices between two spaces. You can get in and try to recover democracy, because the other ways out are war or coup d'etat. They are completely excluded in the case of Venezuela. And unfortunately, we are forced if we want to change things. And we have the idea to have in the future rights that we have known. I mean, in this case, Venezuela, we have no equal marriage, we have no the legal recognition for trans identity, we have no any kind of public policies preserving students to study where they are LGBTI people. We don't have anything. Therefore, and during 25 years, we have been trying to get little thing, but we haven't got anything. And in my case, as in other cases, we are certain that we have to use the tools of democracy in order to recover democracy and try to get rid of the autocracy. And that's not easy, my friend. It's not easy at all.
And Tato, for you, building up to the elections that are coming in Botswana, what are some of the challenges? And, you know, I would also like us to talk about the small victories and sometimes big victories, you know, talk about how the interaction between the civil society organizations and lawmakers, and tell us if it's a healthy space now building up to elections for the LGBTIQ individuals in Botswana.
Well, I think for me, I think you've said it quite perfectly, that elections are not an indication of democracy as a whole. But I think in Botswana, we all know that Botswana has been a beacon of democracy for years. And what I can say is that, you know, with what has been recently happening, especially around the religious community demonstrations, we are anticipating that there may be some sort of prospective approach to democracy by a way of, you know, religious influence. And what this means is that it may be a threat to democracy and the freedoms of the members of the LGBTI communities, as we may have seen the last few months, especially 2 months, where the Evangelical Fellowship of Botswana, or part of the religious community, had gone to the streets to turn a human rights issue and a constitutional issue into a religious propaganda matter instead of a constitutional matter. For me, that is a big issue around democracy. And it simply means that there is a lot more that needs to be done. And yes, we may highlight and note that there may have been a few wins, especially from a legal framework standpoint, where we've seen the win of the decriminalization of Section 164A and C. However, it is quite notable that these wins are only but a start. They are just a beginning towards attaining the right level of democracy, the right level of community engagement and community participation. And the passing of this decrim bill may have been pivotal to the freedoms of the LGBTI communities, because we all know that these laws do criminalize and do challenge both the freedoms of LGBTI community members in their private and also in the public spheres. However, we have seen through the demonstrations of the church that these demonstrations have maybe constructed some societal attitudes, as we have seen in the last 2 to 3 months. And the demonstrations have also caused some kind of panic to the LGBTI communities. They've caused some kind of panic to the larger community as a whole. And we've seen that the very same Bill of 2022, Bill 29 of 2022, has now been deferred to a later stage. That is a threat to democracy. It is a threat even to the elections. We've also seen that the government has also deferred the voter registration. And in fact, the deferment of the voter registration is a big challenge, in fact, to the strength of democracy that we've enjoyed over the years. And what I can also note is that though the winds such as the decrim are setting the right direction or the right agenda to the realization of proper democracy, there's also a need to ensure that we build around proper lobbying for members of parliament, and ensure that we rebuild collaboration with government, collaboration with private sector, to ensure that we strengthen outcomes rather than redress on issues that have impacted members of the LGBTI communities.
Sato, can I just interrupt you about something? Because, you know, I've been in many spaces like this where we hear about how, you know, a constitutional matter becomes a religious matter. And how are you capacitating yourself as Lega Bibo to get to the bottom of the problem? Because we only hear that there is this expensive evangelical project that's being imported into Africa. And we don't have, you know, good enough journalism in Africa to focus on this and find out what's going on. But as civil society organizations in Africa, where we see that the pushback is coming from religious people, how are we creating capacity to deal with that? Are we reaching out to Outright International and to say, hey guys, we need help, we need to find out what's going on? So we don't have the same conversations every now and then because we know where the problem is coming from. How are we capacitating ourselves?
Indeed, we're reaching out to as many partners as we possibly can. We have been very deliberate in how we respond to the EFB. We've gotten out very strongly.
EFB, please.
Evangelical Fellowship of Botswana.
Yeah.
We've come out very strongly to both the EFB and also to government. In fact, the reason why I'm talking specifically to the Bill 29 of 2022 is because we've written to the president of the country to say he needs to advise members of parliament to not act out of manipulation. That is one. We've written letters to the Minister of Justice to say they need to ensure that the response is not only for the majority of the people, but it is also for the minority of the people, because the representation of legislators or lawmakers is not just for the general public, but it is also for those that are not able to speak for themselves. So as an organization, we've also deliberately come out to say, how do we ensure that we reach our members of parliament through the act of lobbying? And we are not only lobbying at parliamentary level, but we're also lobbying at community level, because there are community leaders who are very influential, former members of parliament, former representatives of Botswana to other countries. We have seen on social media some of the biggest influential individuals, including such as Dr. Unity Dao, who is a member of parliament, a former minister of justice, a former judge of the High Court, and is now also sitting on the Pan-African Parliamentary Advisory Board, I believe, who have come out very clearly, even on social media, to say they stand for the rights of the LGBTI communities. We've seen former Minister of Health, Professor Sheila Tlo, who has come out very clearly to say on social media that LGBTI rights are human rights. Yeah. In fact, in terms of responding to this religiosity, it is proved to be quite important that we also need to ensure that we bring the mainstream church or the mainstream Christian community to communicate and to debate with the Evangelical Fellowship or the Pentecostal church movement across the world. We've also been quite deliberate in the use of the word church, because we realize that it is not just about the EFB, but it is about the views of the Christian community on a general, because both the mainstream church and the EFB may be related somehow, and we need to get them to speak. We're also working very closely with different MPs, especially those that belong to the opposition, to say we want to see members of the legislation speaking very clearly, even on public platforms, what their views on LGBTIQ plus issues are. Another key thing that we are realizing that we're seeing is going to play a major role in the next few years, including even as we go towards elections, is strengthening SOGI trainings for members of parliament. Because, you know, we may talk about what is of interest to the people is not necessarily what is interesting to the people. But what we are also seeing is that legislators do not even know the issues. So we need to educate our legislators on the issues, and we need to use the decrim judgment to drive and engage legislators on the need to ensure that we eradicate the issue of manipulation by the church, manipulation by the EFB, manipulation even by the mainstream church.
Thank you. But Gita, let me bring you in here.
Yes.
Let's analyze the political landscape and identify some potential opportunities, you know, and threats. I mean, and I'm talking about the global political landscape, because we're talking about elections that are coming in the coming year, and I would like to hear your point of view on what do you think are opportunities and what do you think are the threats. And I would, that's something that comes to my mind now. I'm thinking about the Russia-Ukraine conflict, you know, which brought, you know, it posed a significant humanitarian crisis, and but it also showed the strength of civil society through Outright International, where my colleague Ami is part of work that's been done in Ukraine that's empowering LGBTIQ people. But let me hear your thoughts on what you think the opportunities and threats are.
You know, so interesting. Also, first to touch on what Tato just said, I think it's important to acknowledge that religions and political parties, they can both be the liberators and perpetrators. So I think it's important to use kind of all the surface that you can. And just on a personal thing, I remember when I was 10 years old in 1985, I was listening to the Swedish Archbishop on TV, and he was advising that all gay people should stay in the closet. And I was like a bit shocked, because I had family members that were that belonged to the community. And nowadays, I mean, the Swedish church is the most liberal one in the world, and they try to influence, I mean, other Christian churches. So I think it's important to see kind of the liaisons. And talking about opportunities also here, one of the most religious countries that we have in the European context is, of course, Poland, that had its elections just in mid-October. And I absolutely hope now that could be a good wave to influence many of the neighboring countries, because we know that we have a very strong Catholic Church in the country that has not been very progressive, rather on the contrary. And that's kind of a deadly combo sometimes, to have very conservative politicians mixed up with the church. Not very good for the rainbow communities. But where you could see that that Donald Tusk, who led the different opposition parties that came from the left, that came from the more like center parties and so on, and different flavors, decided to join, and they managed to win. And I think I was kind of surprised that they managed, but they managed by mobilizing young people, by mobilizing women that were fed up with the anti-abortion laws, by mobilizing people living outside of the country and so on, and people in the bigger cities. So I think it's important to see that we need to be hopeful, and also among our allies, politicians that are standing on the right side of history, that they should not shy away from the values-based political issues. We saw that here in the United States. We had some midterm elections and other things happening not that long time ago, that many of the values-based political issues actually were winning issues. People wanted to stay on the right side of history. So I think that's important, because the trend that I fear a bit right now is even among the allies, it could be conservative politicians, liberals or green or social democrats, that some are feeling a bit right now when the far right is getting so much support in many parts of the world, that they are kind of stepping back a bit, accepting that the agenda is, the political landscape is shaped in another direction. But I think, on the contrary, democracy needs to deliver on the bread and butter issues and everything, but you need to be so strong on these issues. And coming to Ukraine, I was dealing quite much with Ukraine when I was the Swedish Minister for European Union Affairs, and we wanted Ukraine, of course. I mean, I've been pushing for EU enlargement, Ukraine becoming a member of the EU since 15 years back. So I'm so happy now that it's finally happening, some movements in the right direction. But I just remember when I was sitting with the members of the parliament, discussing these things, that you could see some young female politicians that were on the right side of history, but it was hard to identify the people that you could collaborate with. And the EU is so strong on the anti-discrimination issues, but they didn't want to include the LGBTQI+ issues. But on the contrary, right now we have in the midst of a war. You probably heard about how liberal politicians, both from the Servants of the People, the Zelensky's party, but also from Holos, the other liberal party, are now fighting, and they're trying to push for registered partnership, for civic marriages, and are quite successful. And we do from NDI and others as much as we can to support them to continue this fight. And they do that in the midst of a war. We've even had pride parades in cities in Ukraine where they never had that in the past, but in the midst of the war. So I think you need to see that, also use the opportunities when we have a very tough situation to kind of push in the right direction.
I think. Just to jockey on that point, Brigitte, what I'm also picking is that there's a need to redefine democracy, especially in Southern Africa, especially around building capacities for members of the LGBTI communities, especially those who are interested in politics and those who are interested in playing part in democracy, especially by creating platforms for visibility and creating information about issues of democracy and issues of political interest in the LGBTI community. In Botswana, for instance, we are seeing that there are some members in the political spaces of the LGBTI communities, but not at the highest level in terms of legislation, but at the lower level in terms of councils and in terms of administration in political spaces. And it is quite important that we ensure that we capacitate members of the LGBTI community to participate in democracy. And one of the key things is that we need to go above and beyond dialogue with democratic parties or with political parties. We need to even create scorecards on social cohesion and social inclusion to say, are we really achieving? I know that in South Africa, for instance, the South African social cohesion strategy has come out to be very impactful in terms of ensuring that communities come together. And this is something that we have seen that would work in the next year and beyond as we partner with other organizations such as Outright International in creating platforms where members of the LGBTI communities can even become ambassadors at these political parties. And by training these members of political parties, then we are able to then deduce from that and say, what is it that needs to be done above and beyond ensuring that there's inclusion in these spaces?
Thank you. Let's bring Tamara into the conversation. I know democracy isn't a word that's used a lot in the same sentence with Venezuela, but I think you, wearing your hat as a professor of law, what is your definition of democracy? What should democracy look like?
Wow. I think I might give you the same answer when I am asked, what is feminism? And I respond, there is no feminism. There are as many feminisms as you can imagine, because it's like a bit to be a philosopher. Yeah, there are many differences, but what do they have in common in general? The rule of law, fair, free, and accountable elections, accountability of the people that have been elected, and separation of powers. If you have that, you may have a country such as Spain or UK, where you have a king. You used to have a queen, now you have a king. And that changes nothing, because the kings are the queen, and the queens have little power or no power whatsoever. They are symbolic figures, and the real power, and that's another, that's a good question. I love that question. What is the power? That's and what is to have the power, and which in where resides power? but let's not go there because I will stay there for hours and hours.
Yeah, we
and
don't
hours
have
because
that. We don't have that much.
I haven't been able to get a real answer for me. I mean,
Yeah.
I'm in this process in which, in the current state of my research, I conceptualize powers as a. But let's not go there. But let me just say 2 words about churches and power in Latin America, because it's a very common situation we are facing all around the world. And if we could have here people from the Middle East and from the Muslim countries, we'll have exactly the same discussion. For many years, we took for granted that there was a separation between state and churches, and secular states were the rule, even in those countries in which the churches were very powerful. But what happened to Don Quixote in one of the chapters of the second volume. You haven't read it, but he is in his horse, and Sancho goes in back and in a donkey, and then they could not pass through a way in a small town because it was blocked. And the phrase he uses in this case is, Sancho, con la iglesia nos hemos topado, which strictly in a rough translation is, Sancho, we have been blocked by the church. And that's it. I mean, patriarchal system is very powerful, and for the very first time in the whole history of manhood, he has been put, and I say manhood on purpose, had been put on danger, and it put on danger by certain feminism, by LGBTIQ movement, first by certain rights, pro-right movements, and they have decided to attack back. And they are doing so very carefully, very thoughtfully, very well instrumented. And what we have really to do is to understand that civil society, political power, churches that are much more open, as you say, are or have to be allies in this fight. Because what is in danger is global freedom. And we have to understand that. It's sexual and reproductive rights, women's rights, abortion, LGBTI rights, but as well, it's in danger protection to the environment, protection to all minorities, etc. That's what is in danger. And I think that in our case, I've never been a politician. Let me say that. I am a civil society member that had been borrowed by some politicians in order to give them ideas. Because they lack, generally, I have learned that they lack of ideas. and you have to understand that. And when you have someone that is short of ideas, you have to put your ideas into their minds. And that's what we can achieve by doing our work. And to finish, I'm going to change my word. And pardon me, I try, it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I try to be quite lively and a little bit fun in order to make this last session fun enough for you not to sleep in the room. But what I'm saying is very serious things. When you got you make the decision to enter into the politics, it's not because maybe you want to be a politician, it's because you want to make what politicians should have had as the initial motivation, is to change things.
Thank you. Thank you. And I suppose here in the panel, we can agree that the church can be added to the list of things that are a threat to democracy or whatever democracy is, because we are trying to also figure out what democracy is. And Birgitta, this is where I bring you in now about, in this very strange global political landscape that we see, that we see the rise in authoritarian rule and new laws that are, compromise marginalized communities, especially the LGBTIQ. But I quite like the example of Uganda and the World Bank. No more new loans for Uganda in the wake of the law that wants to kill LGBTQ people. But are you able to share some of the strategies that are possible to push back against threats? So I want us to talk about effective strategies to counteract threats to democracy and protect the gains made by the LGBTIQ movement.
No, I think Uganda is very interesting, and I was also quite engaged in that country when I was in Parliament, and also especially as a minister, and I met with Frank Mugisha and Kata Jacqueline and many of them. I went to the country, to Kampala, and also support them. So I think one important lesson that I learned throughout these years is always to discuss directly with the activists, because I think it's very common. Now I'm speaking more from being a former politician from a country in Europe. Sometimes it's very tempting. You have your home audience that is mostly, for my voters, they're very progressive, and they had been with my side on all reforms that we've done back in the Swedish parliament, same-sex marriage and adoption, all the issues that we've been pushing for. So sometimes it's very easy to kind of take, you speak for your home audience in your home country, but you're not listening to the activists. So I think that's one first thing that I wanted to mention, the do no harm policy. To really include the people, and that I learned very much from the Ugandan movement. And I absolutely think what the World Bank did now was very strong and powerful and correct. I remember if we go back maybe 10, maybe 15 years ago when we had similar discussions about these laws, then when we listened to the LGBTQI+ organizations on the ground, they were more like, do not act too quickly and strongly right now. My audience back home wanted me to act very strongly, and they knew that I had been traveling to the country and I had met all the people. I had been discussing with the Minister of Foreign Affairs and so on, but to kind of navigate. Nothing about us without us to talk about from the organizations working with disabilities. I think that's like really, really important to think of. And then another thing that is important when we navigate strongly, now when I have Maria Sjödin here in the room, she was my go-to person for like 20, 25 years, I have to tell you. When I needed to work with more specific, very fragile context and to act smart and strategic, I also needed to discuss with the movement back home in my country what was the smartest way to act, because you had better contacts on the ground than I had. So that was also very valuable to have these people that you could talk to. And you need to have I call them your AOCs, and I'm not referring to the American politician here, even though she's great, but your agents of change. That's so important. I need to have my agents of change when I was in politics. Now at NDIS, I need to have my agents of change. It could be among the NGOs, it could be among politicians, and the community, the rainbow community needs to have their allies in the political party and so on to kind of work on these things. And right now when we have a very kind of not so solid word when it comes to democracy, I think it's important also that you're not shy in the movements, that that you have accountability on the politicians that are on the right side of history, because many of them at the moment are a bit, could accept maybe some backlash in some areas because they still want to be in power, and they need to rely on a maybe far right party that is not so progressive. We see these movements coming up all around the world, and just how to navigate here strongly.
Thank you. And I would also like us to talk about collaboration and coalition building. And, somebody like me who was a journalist for a very long time, and I tend to be very adversarial. I want answers now. I want things to happen. I want what the story I'm doing to have an impact immediately. But it's not the case when you're in the space that we're in now. I would like us to discuss the value in meaningful dialogue with people who don't even see things the same way that we do. And I found it difficult, but now I see that it can bear some results. And I want to hear from you, from all of you actually, with the value in having a discussion with people that do not agree with you, or people who actually are throttling your livelihood or your freedom even. Let's start with you, Tato, and talk about if you see any value in having a discussion. You know, I used to hear Nelson Mandela talking about this or reading about him talking about this, and I didn't agree with him until now. But let me hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I believe it was also Maya Angelou who says, human beings, we are more alike than we are unalike. And in fact, where there is dialogue, it's like having collaboration, because where there's collaboration, there's progress and not redress. And in fact, we've seen that working quite well in our example. For instance, in FY24, for instance, we've seen the collaboration between ourselves and FHI 360 bringing out very important results. And especially now that we are also seeing the emergence of new opportunities like the lift up activities that are allowing us to be able to challenge policies and to challenge policymakers. And this is part and parcel of us impacting the process of democracy. And these lift up activities have also allowed us to ensure that we build scaffolding opportunities to address issues of advocacy and issues of awareness beyond clinical needs for members of the LGBTI communities. We've also seen that dialogues with the private sector has also birthed quite great results in ensuring that we put pressure, on political party leaders and even on the current leadership in terms of government. We've seen some of our community members being part and parcel of the process of the mindset change in the country. And now, with the anticipation of GLIDE, we are anticipating to see that we will impact these partnerships even a lot more. And we are saying, out of these dialogues, there's an opportunity to handle better issues that we could have not handled better previously. But most importantly, in terms of progress from a political standpoint, we would be able to challenge some of the ideologies that are being discussed in Parliament, some of the ideologies that are being discussed at community level, some of the ideologies that, are becoming a discourse, even when they literally are not supposed to be a form of discussion in the communities that we stay. I mean, we've even seen that ever since the demonstration of the church, for instance, some of our community members, out of fear, some of them are killing themselves because they are not able to express themselves. Just a few weeks ago, we were burying a young man in one of the most performing areas in Letlhakane through a program that is supported by one of our big sponsors. This young man killed himself because, access to certain services is not enough. And even when there is that access, they are afraid of the political discourse around them. So I think dialogue is very important, and not just dialogue between ourselves and the political leaders and other administrators or partners. I think also dialogue within these political spaces by themselves would be very important. We need to see members of parliament, we need to see leaders challenge the status quo and ask very relevant questions that impact members of the LGBTI communities.
And Tamara, could you also maybe share your thoughts
on? So much that I think you have such interesting questions for us. I love them. From the personal point of view, I will say that in this moment of my life, I understand that I only really learn from those who think differently than what I think. I mean, this is what challenges me. That's what actually make me put in a separate compartment and see if what I've been thinking is right or wrong, and change my mind. Therefore, I love to exchange ideas and concepts with people that do not think as I do. From the social point of view, it is also so important. Diversity is the core of a much more peaceful, much more progressive, and much more equal society. And without diversity, there is no way you can have a society that it's had developed as its full capacity. But from the political point of view, I have some doubts. And because some cases you have the as a policymaker, you have this dilemma. For instance, what to do with the Nazi?
Yeah.
I mean, they kill 8 million people in Europe, abroad, and then can you accept they reestablish as a political party, or openly ask for I don't know, to kill the Jews again, or as they do with us. I mean, they ask to kill LGBTI people, and that's a difficult answer, because listen to what happened in just 3 days ago in Russia with the decision of the Supreme Tribunal Court of Justice, where they decided basically that they were a extremist group, and they had to be banned of any public space and any public appearance. Therefore, if we come to the first question, what is democracy? And how can we manage to create a democratic society where anyone is able to express themselves? Then we arrive to this very difficult conclusion. Sometimes it is very difficult to be patient, and much more to be tolerant with those who are completely intolerant. And in society, sometimes from the political point of view, sometimes you may have to make a choice.
Yes.
And that's why I divided this answer in personal,
Political.
societal, and political issues.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Brigitte, you wanna-
No, I think it's so important to connect with Tamara said, that to demand that politicians do have strong red lines, because I think that has been the problem, is that the political climate and the debates has been so kind of vulgarized and polarized, because people have not had the ability to have like a strong red line, a decent Democrats, no matter if you're conservative or liberal or green or whatsoever. And we had a very legendary Swedish politician. She died actually early this year, but she was in parliament almost until she was 90 years old, and the one that had been, the mother behind most of the progressive laws in our country. And when I was a newly elected member of parliament, she told me, Birgitta, you need to understand that being in politics is like running a marathon, and you need to be more resilient than your opponents. Barbara Westrom said these words to me, and I think that's so also, I mean, to have the dialogue with the people that you can discuss with, but then you have other people that when they have power, they want to kill you. I mean, what to discuss? I mean, it's important to also to be strong on these things.
Yeah, and staying with you, Birgitte, I want us to now discuss the strategies for navigating uncertain political landscapes. And do you have any observation you can share on best practices for LGBTIQ activists and organizations in navigating those uncertain or fragmented political environments?
You wanted us to be hopeful, and I want to be this now. And I think one of my passions when I left politics and joined the NDI was that I felt very much when I was in politics myself that you had your silos. I was meeting with my liberals. I met them in Europe. I met them in global level. I met them in Scandinavia. But for example, in this issue on LGBTQI+, I knew that, we had allies. Sometimes we were very lonely in our own parties, but we had allies among socialists, among conservatives, among others. So cross-party collaboration, I think, is something that we need to see more of. Both when it comes to defending democracy, but also on pushing for this. And last year, my team, we did a different focus groups with young politicians from all different continents in the world to discuss about different areas that they had identified that where they were on the same page, where they wanted NDI to support them to have stronger and deeper cross-party collaboration. And I was so happy that feminism was one of the issues that they could unite very much on, but this was also one of the topics. And we had people from all countries, from the global south to the global north, all parts of the world, but it was very hopeful. So I think also among the younger generation of politicians, you have the far right, you have, the more extreme parties that are unfortunately getting too strong, but among what I call the decent Democrats from the whole political kind of landscape and field, I think this area is absolutely a successful area, and that makes me hopeful.
That's good to hear. But a more direct question for you, Tato, is, I think navigating these uncertain political landscapes is maybe having access to these politicians who are difficult around, LGBTIQ rights. And I was at the University of Pretoria last week. We were talking about conversion practices, and there was the Norwegian funder who talked about how easy it was to just text a member of parliament to say, "Oh, we have visitors, please come and greet them." Whereas in South Africa, you have to talk to 6 people before you get to the politician who's not even a member of parliament. So you can imagine getting through to an MP is much more difficult. I wonder what your experience is how do you have access to these legislators in your country?
Well, I think sometimes the challenge is whether the politicians want to be accessible. I think that is the first question we should ask ourselves. I mean, Botswana is relatively a very small country, and in fact, Southern Africa is a relatively small part of the African continent. And I'm pretty sure that if we are to do a small study or a dipstick, you and I are probably related somehow. So it is, yes, indeed very difficult to access the politicians. But I think what needs to happen is that we need to strengthen the social structure, the social infrastructure to impact diversity and inclusion, especially in the Southern African region. I think there's key in ensuring that we build some kind of a social cohesion scorecard for political parties and for democracy in the Southern African region, so that we can ensure that we build opportunities for access to politicians, because most of these members of parliament or most of these politicians are members of our communities. They are our neighbors. They are our friends' fathers. They are our friends' mothers and sisters and cousins and everybody else. I mean, I'm sure in my phone I've got a few contacts of those. You send them an SMS, for instance, you send a message to, whoever, a minister or a member of parliament. They will respond to you after a month, after the issue has already been discussed. And so that is the biggest challenge, really. So we need to realign and reconstruct the approach to, how do we hold them accountable? And how do we ensure that we get them to speak? I hope that I've answered you.
Yeah, and well. Maybe you can share, Birgitta, also your experiences of, this access to. You're an MP yourself. How accessible were you, and tell us the benefits of being an accessible MP.
You get more voters. Very, very easy. Very easy, I think. And I think that's also some of the hopeful. I mean, when we see that, especially younger generations in many countries, and we know, I mean, in many countries around the world, people younger than 30 years old, they make up like 70% of the population. So they are like the big chunk of voters. So I think that argument is very tempting to have when you have dialogue with some politicians that do not want to open up or have the dialogue and so on. But I think that's kind of you always need to, when you work with political parties, you need to in one way or the other have the what's in it for me perspective. But the what's in it for me perspective can be very ideological, very progressive. And I think learning from some of the victories that we've had in some countries, I mean, around the world now, when you have tied the values to the issues very strongly and vice versa, you can see that argument is very very popular among politicians to be out there and to be more. And I come from a society where you have more I would say open standards, and when you are a politician, you should be out campaigning all the time. And I think I met I was, of course, online available for my voters all the time, but I had like 2 or 3 times a week, I met people at the parliament that came up to my office and discussed the issues that they wanted me to push for. But then I had very loyal voters. They stayed. Election, they came back, and
oh, okay.
Which was rewarding me.
I see. And I mean, Tamara, you represented something that was rare for a very long time, being a trans parliamentarian in the Americas. And how did that visibility benefit, the LGBTIQ community, and what is your relationship with the community in the country in the absence of protection of laws and policies?
Well, actually, let me tell you that it was quite frustrating because as soon as we were elected with the supermajority, the dictatorship blocked us, blocked the entire powers of and the budget of the parliament. Therefore, we were a symbolic and still, for many countries, including the United States, I still a MP, yeah? Even if my term expired 2 years ago. But for the United States and for around 50 countries in the world, I'm still an MP because it was the last time that we had a kind of fair election in Venezuela. It's quite a bizarre situation. But let's face your question. When I was elected. Let's go before. Before I was elected, when I was put on the list for Caracas, the evac of Caracas called the president of my party, telling him, "Oh, listen, I don't think it's convenient." To have a transgender person, a transsexual person as a candidate in your list that could be considered to be something. And you know that your family has been all time so Christian and so blah, 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 blah. And by fortune, he didn't accept the pressure and I was elected. But this year when I presented myself for the very first trans woman around the world to try to run for the primary elections, presidential elections of a country, and then I just announced that I had the intention, that was in February, beginning March, that I intended to run, and what happened is that someone we haven't had in the past 25 years any large survey about the perception of the society in Venezuela about LGBTI issues. And suddenly someone decided to finance, that might cost $200,000, to finance this large survey about the situation. And they made their, I don't know, 2,000, 3,000, the questions, etc. And oh, surprise, they never use it, but they publish it. And which are the main things I want to talk about this in this moment. And I will finish by saying, what do I learn about that? It's one, about 75% of Venezuelan population is against discrimination against the LGBTI people. 57% is in favor of the legal recognition of trans identity. Only 47% is in favor of same-sex marriage. Lower than recognition.
Interesting.
But this is important because this question was put there for me. Will you vote for an openly LGBTI persons as a president of Venezuela? 40% yes, 10% perhaps. Okay, then you have your answer. And I think the fire went on the right side of the cannon, and they never used this survey, nor their results. But they are useful for me to tell them, listen, you're wrong. You are presuming that people, it's conservative, it's against LGBTI people, are very homophobic and transphobic, and they are no. The majority is not. There's a minority, and the super minority of 5 or 6% is those who doesn't want us to be nowhere, then they prefer us to be dead. But there is like 5 or 6%, no more. Then what I been telling my the candidates that were running with me, 3 of them were quite following the same pattern, because family, whatever, they were following this pattern that you have known here very well. And but when we sat together, listen, why do you say that? Well, I have to say that because my financials. Okay. That's the problem. But the reality is that when you go to the analysis of the results of this survey, you get to the conclusion that they are so wrong, and they are talking to with conspiracy theories and fake news and all that we know very well. They are talking just to a small minority and trying to make afraid other people. That's just the reality. But you cannot then presume that you cannot talk, that you cannot get supported, nor that you cannot be let me finish with this. This is important, I think. When I got into politics, I noticed something. I had always been professor, lawyer, and civil society. And I noticed this, that is different of what you said, that politicians in general feel that they are in a superior stage. And other people are there down there. So if you come and ask something to a politician, okay, let me hear you. What do you have? What is your problem? Let me see. Okay. And it's a kind of complacent and a kind of relation between an adult and a underage person. It's not an equal to equal relation. And when I noticed, when I got into politics, is that politicians started to see me as an equal. The other side problem was that the civil society, the still working in the civil society, tell me, no, you're not civil society, you're a politician now. But some politicians tell me, no, you're not politician, you're civil society. Okay, yes, I am both.
Thank you. I think that's also just a good example that, Tamara is one of the amazing elected officials from the LGBTQI+ community, but it's so very common also that we have very strong popular politicians that have been leading countries, and I think it's so important to just get these stories out, because it's lots of prejudice than people are thinking, but that's not the full picture. So that's important to say.
It's quite important. I agree with you. Tato, any openly LGBTQ lawmakers in Botswana, even on the opposition benches?
No, we don't have those that are openly LGBT.
I mean, I'm going to open up it's going to be the Q&A session, but really I'm opening up for a discussion also, if you feel like you want to talk about something, not necessarily ask a question, because I still don't have my answer on what democracy should look like. And maybe somebody sitting down there can share with us, what democracy should look like, and a democracy that should be inclusive. And what does inclusivity also mean? Because even things that we think are inclusive sometimes leave some people behind. Because I also realized today that how I never mention, like there was a point I will write, Nila fights with me about this sometimes, that I forget the I in LGBTQ. And it's something important that I've changed and consciously do it, because we have to do LGBTIQ. And I'm not being inclusive when I'm a human rights defender myself. So that's something I've learned and I've changed. So let's talk about inclusivity. Let's talk about what democracy is. And any questions you have for the panelists, you can come through to the microphone. But for now, I will take one. The first one will be from the online.
Yes. Kent Clindera has a question. He says, I have witnessed how misinformation via social media is a growing challenge for LGBTIQ movements. Is anyone implementing effective strategies to counter misinformation?
Do you want to take that?
Yes, just shortly from the NDI perspective, we work with this all the time. Integrity, how to fight misinformation, and so on. So this coming year, we'll be working with political parties worldwide on how to strengthen the political parties, the democratic, decent parties, on how to kind of deal with this. It's not especially connected to the LGBTQI+ community or so on, but more like that parties have a very decent kind of level of that.
Yeah, if we add AI to that question, you have the nightmare of the 21st century. Actually, we may have some answers. We may have and implement punctual responses to certain cases, but there is no way in a global world where social media works as they're working, and where you have put on artificial intelligence. There is no way to actually have a full response to misinformation, disinformation, fake news, and the way artificial intelligence might adopt this bias in order to produce a response. I mean, it's a very, very difficult question, and the responses have been punctual. They have been trying to make people try to detect in the existence of fake news and the existence, particularly fake news, because in this case, fake news had been addressed most than other cases, misinformation, disinformation, because in general, fake news are easier to detect for a large group or a well-trained group of specialists. And I think this is there are tools for that. I mean, I have the tools, but I don't have the time to actually go back and find out if this is a fake news or not. And then I rely on the work of other people. But with regard to misinformation, because of the nature of misinformation, and because of disinformation, because of the nature of disinformation, there is nothing true or very little true in misinformation or disinformation. Therefore, you cannot attack them or detect them in the same way. Just say, whoa, this imbecile that's saying this or that, and then that but besides than that, it's not a response, a global response that is easily done.
Well, in our case, what we've also realized about misinformation is that there's need to strengthen discourse or response to discourse that takes place in social media. One of the things that we've picked up, especially in Botswana, is that when somebody posts something, it is the interpretation of what that person is trying to communicate that we must respond to. And one of the key things is ensuring that there is sustained response and sustained campaign towards the discourse around the misinformation. Clear example, the church's demonstration. What we picked up is that what the church's demonstration was, or the information that the church's demonstration was fueling, was not necessarily the perspectives and the stand of the community. So we needed to ensure that we build very strong campaigns to sustain a particular discourse around that misinformation. And I think it is quite important, especially from partners and, to build very strong guidelines on what is it that we need to do to respond to media misinformation, because what is being driven may not necessarily be the perceptions, the ideologies, the opinions of the communities with which the LGBTI persons belong to. And in most instances, as opposed to the one that Tamara was talking about, fake news, in most instances, those that fuel misinformation may be fueling it out of lack of knowledge. And there's a need for us to strengthen that. We've tried at organizational level, but the biggest challenge is always building the right or creating the right instruments to respond to those.
Interestingly, you speak about that Botswana protest. In South Africa, we have what we call Africa Check. I don't know if you've heard of Africa Check. They focused on that protest, and they found that some of the pictures that were used on social media were pictures from a Malawi protest that happened 2 years ago. And you found that some of the children that were used are children who are street kids who are being paid to hold placards that are vulgar against the LGBTIQ community. So we need those kind of resources like Africa Check to push back against the misinformation. Without wasting any more time, please go.
Yes.
Please remember to introduce yourself and your affiliation.
Yes. Hello, Joe Rojas, here they. I'm with National Democratic Institute, like Birgitta, with the Equal Rights and Action Fund. My question will be somewhat specific to Tamara, but I think it can be framed in a way where Tato or Birgitta could speak to the context they're familiar with. And kind of goes back to the beginning of the conversation about working in more autocratic or closed spaces versus more democratic or open spaces. So I was living in Venezuela, studying there in Merida during the December 2015 elections. And to Tamara's point, as a foreigner, I was instructed to stay inside for 48 hours because allegedly the police would shoot at people who had congregated with rubber bullets. And independent vote tracker people got a different result than the government published. So democracy and elections. But my question is sort of about, and I had friends who were still doing LGBTQ activism. When I got back, there were people making asylum claims based on a mix of political and LGBT persecution. Are activists in Venezuela, in terms of tactics or strategies, are they sort of erring on the side of maybe do you kind of downplay or choose not to talk about LGBTQ issues or your LGBTQ identity in favor of being just more generally pro-democracy and in the opposition? Or are still people actively talking about these issues and trying to, either within the opposition or pressuring the existing autocratic government? Not that has to be a binary choice, but I guess how are people navigating that? I guess the same could sort of be applied in other contexts.
I will answer that rapidly. No, they are not broadly talking, but as journalists, we're very smart. During this campaign, they asked to each and one of the candidates several times about LGBTI issues, so they had to talk about it.
Thank you so much. We've got 5 minutes, and part of it is yours. So please ask your question.
Asking a former law professor to speak quickly, I will go and get to the point. Thank you so much. It's been a fantastic conversation. Suzanne Goldberg, I'm with the State Department as a senior advisor and legal expert for the Special Envoy to advance LGBTQI+ human rights. So I want to pick up on the disinformation, misinformation question and agree with you about punctuality being important, and then raise the question, sort of what is it that gets people to change their mind, right? Whether it's an elected official to change their mind about a viewpoint, or whether to meet, or how quickly to speak out, or anybody reading social media. And I always come back to this thing that I ask my classes, which is when's the last time you changed your mind? When's the last time any of us actually changed our mind about anything important? And there's a lot of research that points to, we look to someone we trust. And so I think as we think about how do we engage and push, I always think about what are the lists, which I think you spoke to, Tato, about people who are trusted by broader circles that sometimes reach beyond the circles we reach to help them reconsider and possibly change their mind. So would love to put a question mark on the end of that and get your thoughts.
Thank you. You wanna go?
Well, actually, very short response too. I think we have to learn basically how to give other people a gift, how to open their hearts and their minds. And that's not an easy task, but we have to have this power before. I think it is part of my superpowers, and I try to do it.
No, I absolutely relate, and I think it's very much around personal stories. I mean, I think what we've seen in countries that have been, that used to be kind of conservative but are now more progressive, it's very much when you know a person. And that's kind of the connection. And I mean, when you're a politician, when you're campaigning, I mean, you want to have the in-person meetings, family to family, people are talking. So I think that building on the strong narratives, that's why we need to be so active in social media and so on, countering the evil people out there that are pushing for the hate speech and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, 100%. I think you've part answered the question. people respond to what concerns them, to what they believe in. And I believe that we need to build that trust around people and we also need to build very strong discourse around issues that really affect people and affect people at the root cause.
Oh, thank you so much. And I think it's a wrap of this very important discussion. And I would like to thank each and every one of you for your time, for your insights, and everything else that you've given to the advancement of LGBTQ rights in this discussion. I really appreciate it.